When you have more people on the rolls who are eligible to vote, that's a pretty good darn indication that the state isn't taking reasonable steps to clean up the rolls. This is what I love about Judicial Watch. I mean, we don't slow down. We don't slow down. There's all this work, all this corruption's going on here in D.C. with the abuse of Trump and Hunter and Joe, but there's all this other hard work and all this heavy lifting that needs to be done for the rule of law separately, not only on those issues, but other issues as well. And we just don't stop. We're like the Energizer Bunny. I guess I'm dating myself, right? I don't even know if they use the bunny in commercials anymore. We just keep on going. So accordingly, we filed an amicus brief up in Maine. And why were we filing an amicus brief up in Maine? Because Maine was taking the position that no one effectively should be able to look at their voting rolls to make sure they're clean, which is so contrary to everything we've been fighting for and the plain reading and meaning of federal law. It's just extraordinary. As you may recall, we just had a settlement with the state of Illinois that had restrictions in their voter rolls that were initially absurd. In order to look at their, I forget the number of people on the voting rolls, it's got to be in the millions, you had to go down to Springfield, Virginia and look on, voter registration by voter registration on one computer terminal. They weren't making the data widely, available in an accessible format that someone could actually figure out how the data was being managed in terms of ensuring the rolls were being kept reasonably clean as federal law requires. And they settled and they said, okay, we'll do that now for you. Maine is still fighting, even though they had an adverse court decision. So we came in and helped one of our allied groups there with an amicus brief. We filed an amicus brief supporting the decision of the U.S. District Court for the District of Maine, which struck down Maine's policy restricting the use and distribution of the state voter registration list. The lawsuit citing the National Voter Registration Act is now in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, which is the circuit that covers Maine. So by way of educating you, if you don't know, so you have these federal court judges, these are the district court judges that initially hear cases, and above them are the appellate courts. And the appellate courts are divided into circuits, right? So D.C. is its own circuit. The First Circuit covers Maine and a few states up that way. The Ninth Circuit covers most of the world out in the West Coast. The Fifth Circuit covers Texas in part. So when I say the First Circuit, that's essentially the appellate that's the appellate court that has jurisdiction over Maine. And I say that not because I think you're all dumb, but because a lot of people don't know that. I mean, it took me a while to figure out how all that worked when I was working at Judicial Watch. So I certainly want to share that knowledge with you. In the last 10 years, no organization, public or private, has obtained more statewide settlement agreements or consent decrees against chief state election officials for violations of the National Voter Registration Act than Judicial Watch. As part of its list maintenance enforcement efforts, Judicial Watch also routinely requests public records of voter registration activities in various states under Section 8I of the National Voter Registration Act and is sued on its own behalf on behalf of others to enforce it. The public disclosure provision of the National Voter Registration Act embodies Congress's intent that Americans' right to vote must not be sacrificed to administrative chicanery, oversights, or inefficiencies. The Registration Act's public disclosure provisions mandates that state officials labor under a duty of accountability to the public in ensuring that voter lists include eligible voters and exclude ineligible ones in the most accurate manner possible. The law provides an avenue for citizens to check that and to ensure that only eligible registrants remain on the rolls by providing the full voter registration list open to public inspection. Without such transparency, public confidence in the essential workings of democracy will suffer. No court has adopted the Maine's argument here. Rather, all courts presented with this issue have found that the voter registration list is a record subject to disclosure under federal law. The court should reject the argument. So the last we checked up there in Maine, they're not keeping their list terribly clean. In 2020, Maine statewide registration rate was 101% of eligible voters. Now, depending on the timing there, that's obviously off. Now, the registration rates, they're a little bit higher than they used to be. Like 90% isn't unusual. Maybe 85% is often the measure. Just think that not everyone registers the vote. That's why you have voter registration drives. If that were the case, you wouldn't need those drives. So when you have more people on the rolls who are eligible to vote, that's a pretty good darn indication that the state isn't taking reasonable steps to clean up the rolls. It means they've got more people around on the rolls who are around to vote. And so there's a good reason to check their rolls. Federal law mandates voter roll transparency. Given Maine's refusal to release its voter roll information, it's reasonable to think that cleaning up voter rolls is not a priority. Dirty voting rolls can mean dirty elections. Don't you agree? Now, Judicial Watch, as I noted earlier from my discussion of our amicus brief, is a national leader in voting integrity, election integrity, and voting rights. As part of its work, Judicial Watch has assembled a team of highly experienced voting rights attorneys, some of whom worked at the Justice Department, who stopped discriminatory elections in Hawaii and cleaned up voter rolls in California, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky, among other achievements. Bob Popper, who is Judicial Watch's senior attorney, leads our election law program. He previously was at the voting rights section of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, where he managed voting rights investigations, litigations, consent decrees, and settlements in dozens of states. So when Judicial Watch speaks on voting issues, election integrity, our expertise is second to none. We've been doing this for decades. I remember in 2000 driving around Florida counting ballots as the left was trying to steal, it looks like, the election in Florida. And Judicial Watch's efforts to count those ballots essentially confirmed that Bush won. And that really checked efforts to steal the election otherwise, because they knew someone was watching and looking at the ballots carefully. And just in the last year or so, Judicial Watch's litigation has resulted in at least 2 million names plus being removed from voter rolls across the land. In California, as we say, Kentucky, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, even New York City. 440,000 names removed after we sued, so we settled. And one of the ways we figure out how many names need to be removed is by gaining access to these voter rolls. And I will tell you, dear voter and dear citizen, that law I referenced, Section 8I, the National Voter Registration Act, gives you the right to ask your local and state elected officials and election officials, I should say, for access to their records about how they're maintaining the rolls. You have a right under federal law to ask for these records and get access to them. So hopefully the First Circuit requires transparency in Maine. And Maine's a small state, right? It's not a big state. But, it's important that every state's rolls be clean as reasonably as possible. I know it's not reasonable to expect all the rolls be perfect. It's just not going to be the reality of life. But they got to be taking reasonable steps to clean up the rolls. And, that's not happening evidently in Maine. And the fact they're hiding the rolls from outside eyes, prying eyes, so that they can figure out what's going on, suggests that they have something to hide. But in these days of close elections, it's more essential than ever to ensure that all voting rolls are clean, especially since the left and too many people on the right, or happy to do this, is they've been mailing ballots willy-nilly in recent years to people based on their voter registration status. And if they're not eligible to vote, there's a danger that people who aren't eligible to vote are getting ballots in the mail. So that's why it's important the rolls be clean, because it means cleaner elections. And all I can say is, God bless Judicial Watch for doing this, because it would not be done. By the way, this law is supposed to be enforced by the Justice Department too, and they just don't want to do it because the left wants dirty rolls, in my view, and they oppose our doing this generally because I think they rely on dirty rolls as a little bit of insurance in case they need to go to the pot and get illegal votes in a close election. I mean, why else would you oppose cleaning up the rolls? I don't think there's any reasonable basis for doing so. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like our video down below.